Hi, I'm Dakin Matthews, and this is Sheltering with Shakespeare. Today we continue our exploration of Renaissance psychology in all its variety. In part one, we saw that the body-soul connection was at the heart of any psychological system in the Renaissance. And because of the dominant Christian theology, they viewed the body-soul connection as compromised by the fall of man, resulting in man being born in a state of sin, basically with an imbalance between the soul and the body, where the soul's intended control was weakened and the body's needs and passions were dangerously strengthened. And looking further at the body's part in the equation, we found a further distinction in the Renaissance mind between physical appetites and physical emotions, so that in a sense, Renaissance thinkers also viewed human psychology in a top-down tripartite way: mind, passions, appetites, head, heart, gut. Now, a parallel psychology was also developed at this time, again on classical models, called humor's psychology, which basically credited bodily fluids with creating and influencing most human moods and personalities, and therefore most human activities. There were 4 such fluids coursing through the body: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm, and each was associated with one of the 4 elements, respectively: air, earth, fire, and water. When properly mixed or balanced, the person had a neutral or good disposition or temperament or complexion. When, however, one dominated the body, the person would become sanguine, blood, melancholic, black bile, choleric, yellow bile, or phlegmatic, phlegm. And different mixtures of the humors would yield different subpersonalities. When heated, these fluids became fumes and vapors, which could rise in the body and influence the heart and the brain, causing, for example, greater courage in the heart or greater wit in the brain, at least if you believe Falstaff in his monologue on Sherry Sacked. Others might think they would compromise the heart and the brain. Humor's psychology also made it possible to explain planetary influence on the human psyche. As the moon could control the tides, so the planets could affect the humors, and thus a central tenet of astrology, which was widely believed even by Christian theologians, was given a pseudoscientific explanation. So thus far we have 3 different coexisting psychologies to choose from. One with a 2-part explanation, soul-body; one with a 3-part explanation, mind, heart, gut; and one with a 4-part explanation, blood, black bile, yellow bile, phlegm. So I guess we should not be surprised that we will find a 5-part explanation. This one is called faculty psychology, dividing the physical side of the human psyche into 5 compartments, as it were, each with a separate function or faculty. Just as there were 5 external senses, so there were 5 internal senses, still body-based, still primarily physical. The first one received impressions from the 5 outer senses and combined them into a single image. This was called the common sense. The second received the imprint of this image. It had various names, but perhaps cognitive sense will serve. The third could hold on to images. It was called memory. The fourth could reproduce images. It was called imagination or fantasy. And the fifth could immediately evaluate the image as something welcome or unwelcome. It was called the estimative sense. The reason these are all physical powers or physical senses rather than spiritual powers is that animals who do not have rational souls also have these faculties. Animals sense and recognize the real world, remember things, dream things, and have an instinct for good or bad. So, often, when Shakespeare speaks of something making an impression on the mind, he thinks almost unmetaphorically of a real impression, as if the mind, or sometimes the heart, were wax, capable of receiving and retaining an actual image. And when he talks of imagination, he thinks of fantasies or imaginations or dreams or hallucinations as images reproduced by the imagination, even images of objects never before received, but rather composed of separate images drawn from the memory and now conflated. Thus, the products of the imagination are separate images from those originally received from the common sense, which last only so long as the external stimulus is there. The imagination's images are produced from within, without the external stimulus. So where does that leave the spiritual faculties of the soul? The ones that only humans have and animals don't. They are called the intellect, or sometimes the wit, and the will. First of all, both are entirely dependent upon the 5 external and the 5 internal senses. They cannot perform their functions without them. Nevertheless, again in an inexplicable way, which lies at the mystery of the soul-body connection, the functions of the intellect and the will can be purely spiritual. Intellect is like spiritual cognition, capable of abstract thought, reasoning, understanding, wisdom, judgment, all beyond the capacity of animals. Free will is like a spiritual appetite, hungering for the good, and yet capable of undetermined, unbounded choice, which was also, they thought, beyond the capacity of animals, who reacted as they were determined to on instinct. In the human being, by the way, conscience, also called remorse, takes over the job of instinct in animals and builds on it. And in the human psyche, intellect and will, however weakened they were after the fall of man, carried on a constant back and forth, like a conversation, the intellect presenting the will with choices, the will choosing them or not choosing them. But the choices offered and the choices made could still be tainted by man's fallen physical nature, whereby his appetites and passions, his likes and dislikes, the affects he was born with, now out of control, infect the choices and the choosing by making something seem better than it is, or seem good when it is not, all because the intellect has been darkened and the will weakened by sin. And sometimes the intellect may be so darkened and the will itself so perverted that neither needs any tainting from the appetites or the passions to choose evil. The intellect is not confused, nor the will fooled, but both conspire together to choose evil for its own sake, and that is the greatest of sins. So we have, as it were, at the dark ends of the psychic spectrum, madness and malice. The first is the overthrow of the mind by the body. The second, where the mind stays in control, but chooses evil for its own sake. Dante's Circles of Hell, by the way, and Malcolm's Catalogue of Sins in Macbeth are both based on the Renaissance perception of human psychology. At the same time, and on a lighter moment, emotions and appetites are not essentially bad things. When God made man, he saw that it was good. Empathy, mercy, fellow feeling, human kindness, courage, joy, hope are all positive emotions, and hunger and sex keep us and the race alive. So it is not so simple as intellect good and emotion bad. In fact, Shakespeare often favors the simple truth of the heart over the over-rationalizations of the intellect. The chorus in Henry V certainly favors English hearts over French policy. In summary, these four different psychological systems all coexisted with one another in the Renaissance mind, even with their inherent contradictions. And Shakespeare could move back and forth among them at will, just as we often move back and forth among our differing psychological systems, when he has his characters speak of their own internal lives, or guess at the internal lives of others. But the language is always specific, and the psychology can often be quite physiological. Sighs and tears actually prevent the overheated heart from breaking. And poets, lovers, and madmen are of imagination all compact. And reason sometimes panders will, and fancy is born in the eye, and affection is the mistress of passion, and will may mutiny with wit's regard, and one can choke on one's collar. And the soul does work justly and secretly with the body. I'm Dakin Matthews, sheltering with Shakespeare.